Thanks, Douglas.
Can I open the room?
Yes, by all means. Well, I might just get started. So thanks everyone for joining us here today. This symposium is a showcase of some of the research that is being done at the Centre of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education at the University of Newcastle in Australia. And one of the ideas that had been at the basis of this symposium is trying to think through the way in which broader social and systemic inequalities affect people's experiences of higher education. A substantial amount of research but certainly policy is focused quite narrowly about the way in which higher education inequalities play out in terms of what's happening directly inside of higher education, whether it's through access or participation outcomes, graduate outcomes. And very little is exploring the broader systemic nature of those inequalities. They're often positioned as a sort of narrow background, rather than actually considering the way in which people live through these. So this problem has been at the heart of the inception of the Centre of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education, or otherwise known as SRHE. I should have said that the first time. So one of the problems that has been built into our research, I think for some time, has been trying to understand these broader relationships. And sometimes they're not necessarily the direct focus of our research, but it is certainly key to the way in which we approach research across our projects within the centre. So I'm chairing the session today, and I'll be heading up first with a paper about some of my ideas about class at the moment. We'll then be going into, I believe it's Matt and Ryle's paper. Is that second? Is that right? Yep, there it is. Trying to explore different ways of approaching and thinking about evaluation. Before Penny and I believe Steph as well, will be talking about research exploring the role of gender-based violence and the way in which that it affects people within higher education. So with that as an introduction, I thank you all for joining the session. And I will begin by introducing myself and my paper. So I'll just pretend that I just paused for a while. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, everybody. My name is Matt Bunn. I'm a research fellow at SRHE. I've worked across quite a lot of different projects in our centre. And one of the key areas that I've continued to think about is class. And this has been, whether it's through things like class and time, and the ways in which people can access or the ways in which employment opportunities and the like are affected by class. In this paper, I'm not drawing explicitly from any one area of my empirical work or the literature, but rather trying to start to conceptualize a way of thinking about class in what I'm calling class as friction, to try and understand and characterize some of the changes in class that are being produced within a changing higher education landscape. And I suppose what, in a nutshell, the reason why I've been thinking about this is because I think that class homologies are becoming more and more difficult to track and to understand, and trying to actually think about the idea that class is produced through spaces of difference. And so that is, sorry, I just... So before I get too far into this idea, I just want to think, I don't want to, class has been around for a long time to think about higher education inequalities. And it's, we can go all the way back some time to thinking about this, but of course, Pierre Bourdieu is notable in his work on this topic. One of the ways in which this was is characterized is the sort of shift between one of the sort of dominant structures the structures of domination within our society, moving from religion to education. And this was characterized as the move from theodicy, that is the idea that suffering and the distribution of domination and resources and the like was all a part of God's plan, in a sense that this was a sort of tautological reasoning, whereby you didn't actually have to think past that point. Bourdieu's point is that we've moved into what we would call a sociodicy, in the sense that higher education plays the role of effectively laundering intergenerational privilege. And in this, concepts like charisma, intelligence, giftedness are all ways in which education are channeled within higher education. And so we can actually, one of the ways that he characterized higher education is effectively being a space whereby rich people can hang out for a while, learn some things, but actually launder that pre-existing privilege to demonstrate that, so-called superiority. So effectively, class has been around for a while to understand higher education, but of course, moving into the period, I guess it characterizes our current era with widening participation policy. A higher class has been reasserted in different ways in people's analysis within this space. And even though widening participation has seen a substantial shift in the rhetoric and I think discourses of higher education, it's unclear how much that has changed the composition of underrepresented students within higher education. We recently completed a literature review in SRHE that is currently under embargo. But one of the things, I was reading quite a lot of research, I think maybe 60 to 80 papers on this particular part of on different areas of deficit discourses and people using concepts like cultural capital. And one of the nauseating things that to try and read through this work was how often people start by saying, yeah, a lot of money has been thrown at this, a lot of discourses, a lot of sort of initiatives. And not that much has changed overall in people's outcomes. And of course, class has been used much more heavily within the UK. In Australian research, it's much more limited. Concepts like low socioeconomic status or socioeconomic status are used much more heavily as a sort of way to frame sort of what I call, I guess, vertical differentiation within the space. But one of the things that I think overall, despite that the literature demonstrates here, is that something has shifted in terms of the way in which class has been struggled over from around the university that is outside of the walls versus whether or not you can get in at all. And something has shifted towards there being a struggle from within universities, a point I'll almost critique of myself in a little while. So with that, I'm just going to jackknife into an autobiography of the question here, because with that as a setup, I think that one of the things that I struggle with is with the concept of class is actually rooted in my own understanding of the concept coming from the working class myself. And I've often found it confusing to try and understand the notion of class homology within this space. And this comes from the chaos of my own mixed experience. I think it's taken me roughly 15, 16 years to try and start to, or try to get my head around it and get at least as far as I have right now. Where very briefly, I'm from the Hunter Valley in Australia, and at the head of which is the town of Newcastle. Newcastle being named such precisely because it was being used as an export city for coal back to the UK. And so from the inception of Newcastle, we have exported coal. And today we actually have the largest coal port in the world. So it's quite funny because my grandfather's work was in looking after rail lines for coal trains. And then my dad got a apprenticeship as a 17-year-old and went into mining, to which he just recently retired. He worked in the one job all his life. The one difficulty, however, in doing so in Australia is that mining has led to quite a lot of people getting quite a lot more money within the miners in Australia make really good money. So my dad's income actually meant that despite the fact that we were working class, we were always comfortable. And one of the difficulties in even the town, the village that I grew up in, most of the other people around me had far less sort of disposable income and the like. So most of my friends came from, a range of, for example, unemployed, or chronically unemployed families and the like. So already here, it was quite a mixed experience for me because most of my friends had all kinds of different experiences of suffering or inequality in their lives. We had it on some fronts, but economically we were okay. And then, of course, my mum's side of the family came from basically housing estates. When the first experience I actually had of the middle class in a dominated space was actually higher education. And it took me roughly, I don't know, maybe 10 years to sort of understand that that's what it was, or that's what it felt like. And there were two major points, I think, to sort of draw from that, which was that up to the time that I was about 21, my major experience of the working class had been quite diverse. There were lots of people who had different cultural ideas, values, tastes, etc. So it was quite diverse in that regard. And coming up against the idea of class as these broad, not necessarily static, but certainly I think easily generalizable homologies around what characterized the working class, I found quite challenging at times. It was actually finding work, particularly within the Borgesian tradition, around concepts like symbolic violence that actually allowed me to place my experience a little bit more closely. But nevertheless, I always struggled around the idea that it was easy to sort of bound, for example, within the Borgesian framework of class, people into sort of similarly shared social spaces like that. There was a lot of differentiation and struggle within the working class as it would be sort of characterized. So I offer that more as a way of trying to position my own experience in trying to understand this and why I pursue the concept of class. And so moving on, I think the point that I've started to bring out there is the idea of homology. Now, this is the basis, certainly at least in my reading of class theory, of theorizing class. It's about understanding these larger kind of bounded spaces. And this can be whether it's through sort of Goldthorpe's model or the neo-Marxists being rather obsessed with trying to delineate what the differences in classes were. It can be through looser homologies, such as looking at things like occupation, income, and postcodes, or alternatively looking at homologies such as Bourdieu's work on distinction, to explore common patterns, traits, tastes, dispositions, and so on, that all look to understand that clustering. And that's not a critique, by the way. I think that this is really important, but I'm trying to set up a sort of analytical position, I guess, that can perhaps complement that. So my point then is that is trying to understand the idea of class being produced in spaces of difference as difference, rather than being produced as a homology that then sort of hits these boundaries, thinking about the way in which class boundaries are the production of class, and maybe letting go a little bit more of the idea of those homologies. And I would argue that higher education is a really important space for understanding class in this manner, because it is, especially within, for example, in Australia, regional universities. I suppose in the UK, perhaps the equivalent is post-92 universities, but the idea of spaces where there is actually a working class presence on higher education campuses, that is being actively struggled in a sort of phenomenological way. It's not around the outsides, it's in the day-to-day experience and distribution and redistribution of sort of class-based understandings of self. And so one of the things that I see, and I'm sorry, I'm speaking around some of the details here, but I see this as being powerful, as these operators limit experiences for class, in the sense that there's only so far that certain kind of dispositional forms and traits and the like can go before they need to actually start to go through adaptation or mutation, in the sense of trying to organize and re-understand ourselves in order to fit within these spaces. And here I often think of people like Jess Abraham's work and Jess Gagnon's paper on single mothers, because one of the things that it demonstrates is that sort of manipulation of narrative, particularly in Gagnon's example, where we need to constantly readapt ourselves within the space in a series of different ways. And I think that one of the powerful things for taking this approach is that, even though, and I can see one of the problems that I have is that I, of course, fall right back into using these broad homologies of working class and middle class in particular as easy, convenient representations, despite the fact that they're doing the representation of violence that I'm actually trying to avoid. But you know, I might figure through that at some point. But I think one of the important things that I'm trying to reach for here is trying not to assume false class homologies around things that are either historically thought of as being to do with class, but may actually not be where class has moved to, particularly within education or in higher education. And I think even though there is that need, as I guess I've sort of alluded to produce what Bourdieu would call an epistemic subject, that is a sort of almost like a snapshot or a two-dimensional person for the sake of actually producing knowledge about them. Also, I think there is a substantial risk of producing an epistemic violence as well, in the sense of limiting the ways in which class identities can actually be known within higher education. And this links into an idea that I've been playing with for a while of trying to incorporate de Souza Santos' notion of sociology of absences into understanding class. And in a number of the different projects that I'm working on, including understanding rural experiences of higher education, and thinking about care leavers, or as we're theorising at the moment, people with care experience, and trying to, and who would both be incorporated within their own respects, not to mention a series of other ways in which we can identify into class. But one of the things that I suspect that we're often dealing with is the part of the working class that was the most adapted to being able to fit into higher education in the first place. And so trying to understand ways to avoid doing this epistemic violence by incorporating people into the way in which we understand class, despite the fact that there's a significant absence of quite a large body of different people experiencing different forms of marginalisation being bound up in class identity. So I'm running out of time, but I might just conclude and skip over one key section that I'm going to miss here. But an obvious critique here is that maybe class is just staying the same. Things like credentialism, for example, and the sort of, I guess, the attrition to gain symbolic capital through things like, for example, postgraduate degrees is an obvious kind of shift of class just in a new direction to maintain a similar boundary, along with the sort of the holding of static boundaries through things like elite institutions still playing out. But nevertheless, I think that one of the really important things is to be able to actually understand, particularly through particular higher education spaces, is the way in which that class is being produced inside of the campus, or sorry, inside of the institution, and the way that it's being played out as a sort of through a social phenomenology and an effective experience that is producing a distribution, I think, of people back into classed positions. So with that, I'll leave my paper there, and I think maybe I'll just pause for 5 minutes of discussion, and then we can move to Matt and Ryle's paper at I guess in your time, 9:30. So are there any questions for that? Well, I shall take that as a no. Well, with that, thank you for listening. And I shall, and Matt and Ryle, are you okay to begin?
Absolutely. Is that audio working?
All right. So the next paper then is Ryle Gordon and Matt Lum, and they will be presenting the situated evaluation, subverting and rebuilding methods.
Is that working? Yep, all good. Yeah, so thanks, Matt, and great to be here. My name is also Matt, which is endless fun here in SRHE. I have multiple Matts. My colleague, Ryle, I'll hand over to in a minute. And this is a presentation, a paper about equity higher education and what we're calling a situated evaluation. We are a centre which, as you will have heard from Matt's paper, is deeply, I guess, working through the difficult concept of equity in relationship to higher education. Certainly a project which many of you will be well familiar with in terms of the fact that Australia borrows much higher education policy from the UK. This is a project that plays out very differently in relation to context, and certainly in terms of the way that project of equity is framed. We are a centre led by Professor Penny Jane Burke that advocates for a form of social justice framing. Now, the policies and programs that circulate around this agenda, this equity agenda, and often the related widening participation discourse, operating conditions which commonly demand certain approaches to evaluation. And when we're saying evaluation in this paper, we're largely talking about evaluation of policies and programs, rather than, for example, other evaluative efforts such as assessment. But we argue these approaches to evaluation that are commonly demanded are really a big problem at times, because they can readily reinforce dominant values and valuations, and in this way reproduce forms of social inequality. Now, a way we're trying to think about these challenges when approaching evaluation is to recognise how any evaluation of a policy or program is always situated, and to consider what this might mean for the practices taken up in an evaluation, practices that might just hold the possibility of producing new futures. So, as I said, I'm going to get us started, articulate some of the problem as we see it, a little bit more of the context here in Newcastle, Australia, how we're approaching this problem tentatively, and then I'll hand over to Ryle, who's going to provide something of an illustration of this approach and share directly from one SRHE, Centre of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education program. So this notion of equity and widening participation, as I'm sure many of you are aware, has become an ongoing policy desire across much of the globe, attached to processes of massification in higher education, and commonly framed around notions such as social mobility, employability, etc. Often there is a focus on barriers, which some people in the room, including Penny, have for many years now argued can be a real problem, because it leaves institutions as these sort of neutral venues to facilitate this growing participation in something of a crude and impoverished construction of the way in which social inequalities operate, as Matt was articulating, from beyond the walls, but of course within them. Sometimes these projects are enabled by a perspective, somewhat naive perspective. You could argue that formal educational participation has generally positive consequences for the individual or a particular community, or it might simply hold on to a crude focus on nation-state productivity. Now, we are generally worried about the state of contemporary formal evaluation. We do take issue with much of it. We're worried, certainly in our context, how a lot of conventional frameworks can work to frame and then reinforce particular values and valuations of policymakers or researcher evaluators, such as ourselves. And of course, the evidence therefore produced through these processes being unsurprisingly shaped by those values and valuations. Now, of course, there is work in various literatures in relationship to policy or program evaluation that do take up forms of commitment to social justice, framed differently, of course, every time. You'll see here work referenced around sort of ideas of transformative, democratic, critical, culturally or contextually responsive evaluation. And certainly in the Australian equity and widening participation context of higher education here, there is a growing body of work looking at these central ideas of evidence, ethics, impact that circulate within these processes of evaluation at different scales, taking up very different sort of epistemological positions and frameworks within that, of course. And there's work referenced there at the end, led by Ryle, but Matt and Penny and myself working together to bring in Butler to think about performativity and evaluation of or for equity in higher education as a way to sort of trouble some of the taken for granted assumptions that are present, we would argue. But following Paddy Lather in this paper, we're concerned about the way the conditions that these evaluative projects are operating in can tend towards something of a reduction of accountability, or the idea of accountability, the concept, a reduction to what we sometimes see of crude forms of measurement constructed by those, for example, in institutional hierarchical authority positions. And we want to move instead to something different because of those commitments to different arrangements, what we could argue are more just arrangements, how in that we can work to re-articulate systems of accountability if instead of those reductions, we're attempting to do justice with and not to local communities, for example, those public funds, as we understand, are intended to serve. One thing we want to foreground here in how work in this field within these conditions can fall into what we see as a worrying form of positivism, and how particular empiricisms are arguably simultaneously denied and carried forward in what, and you see on the slide here, Lather and Kinchler have separately and differently termed sort of a zombie or crypto positivism, which holds on to a form of objective, value-free, independent gaze. And specifically in this, our concern is how these perspectives can help underpin that sort of the language we hear most days in our line of work, sort of best practice scaling up work, which again Lather has vehemently sort of critiqued and described as being marked by this language of, for example, transparency or evidence-based this and that, linked to sort of that technical imaginary, and often under a banner of mixed methods as a cover for arguably positivist qualitative work. And we believe evaluation can be much more than that, much more than a set of technical practices, for example, to follow. And we want to acknowledge there are many forces pushing on any evaluative effort. Knowledge hierarchies, relationships, knowledge commitments such as searches for truth, particular ethics, timeframes, dispositions, a wild array of forces, and how these contribute to creating a space for evaluation to happen within. And for this reason, as a central idea for this paper, we believe it is helpful to think of any evaluative effort as always situated, never clean or context-free, which I guess motivates the question for us: what type of space do we want to create for evaluation? And again, drawing on Lather, we're looking to navigate these very difficult conditions, to resist certain approaches and lean towards others. And we're interested in that, I suppose, how the dynamic between methodologies and methods allows for an evaluation to perhaps pursue a commitment to social justice when working with or through this difficult concept of equity. What are the practices, for example, that allow for a realization of methodology and method? And rather than assuming that a choice of methods that embody a methodology will deliver on that approach, how is it that we can, I guess what we're arguing for is this a rigorous, no, it's a contentious word, an ongoing interrogation of how methods are deployed to be able to prepare for and reflect on the emergent and unpredictable nature of methods. And again, just I guess we do want to resist particular evaluative effects that can be felt through or outcomes of particular evaluation processes that we would argue reproduce a deeply inequitable status quo. And we're drawing here a little on Sarah Amsler in particular, because one way we're thinking about evaluation is as a reflection on what has happened within a program, within a context. And I suppose, arguably the practices used to do that reflecting work on the past affords us new ways of imagining futures. Now, in this work by Amsler and Facer, of which you might be familiar, they consider the characteristics of advanced capitalist societies and also the possibility of counter-hegemonic forms of evaluation, but also the different modes they see, modes of anticipation, and ultimately argue that pedagogical work, and we do see our conceptualization of evaluation as such, pedagogical work that embraces critical modes of anticipation can offer alternatives to contemporary regimes of anticipation in education. And what we're interested in here is exploring how certain evaluation practices too, if we consider them as pedagogical spaces, might just hold the possibility of producing new imagined futures, as difficult, as problematic as these efforts might be, as tenuous, tentative, uncertain. And building on this point, we want to aim to identify how program practices can help to allow for certain evaluation practices that might just in turn allow for new ways of imagining futures. And on that front, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Raul to begin to articulate some of the approaches that we're taking up here in SRHE, some of the programmatic contexts. I'll hand over to you, Raul.
Thanks, Matt. I'll just share my slides. Does that come up? Okay. So Matt has described our SRHE evaluation context. What I want to do for the rest of the presentation is to talk about certain practices and methods that we've actually used in a recent SRHE evaluation to provide, I guess, an illustration of sorts of some of our evaluation practices. I should point out that what I'm about to describe, it's not, I guess, the traditional nuts and bolts of what is often seen as the key components of an evaluation plan. And instead, what I want to describe, it's some of the practices that we've used to create a space that we hope would be conducive to our commitment to social justice. Matt described this idea of how we might create a space, and this is kind of what I want to explore. So the name of the SRHE project is Reclaiming My Place, and it's a participatory group program that creates spaces for women who are engaged with human services to consider the possibilities of lifelong learning through art making. The human services are typically homeless services, family and domestic violence support services, or family support services. Our colleague, Felicity Kokozuli, known as Flick, she facilitates the program, and I come in to support and facilitate the slightly more formal moments of evaluation. Now, as well as the women participating in the program, the human service practitioners themselves often participate, and they may, although not always, but they may have a relationship, possibly a client or a counselling or a support worker relationship with some of the women who are in the group. And it's interesting actually how their presence in the space has become quite pivotal for the reflection and the evaluation to happen. And I'll touch on that in a moment. And I should say our distinction between reflection and evaluation is really only in degree of formality. We view evaluation as a formalized form of reflection that has things attached to it, such as an explicit logic, rationale, products, broad communication, type of thing. So everyone in the room or in this space is considered a co-facilitator, a co-participant, and a co-contributor to the ongoing design of the program. And obviously, each participant has different skills and strengths, but the space is designed to explore those strengths, and especially in the context of reflection and evaluation and the strengths that might contribute to that. And this also applies to the art, to the program, and to life beyond the program as well. And one of the main purposes of the program is to open up pathways for participants to begin or to continue or to develop lifelong learning journeys. And it has I guess you could call it a grassroots focus, as in we most definitely are not saying that university is the right goal to aim for or the right pathway. The program, it involves collaborative art making that engage the women in ways that aim to be equitable and hopefully transformative. And it inspires a sense of hope and the idea that there is something else out there. In this way, the program, it aims to build knowledge which can contribute to the enhancement of existing programs for women survivors that often lack a focus on the longer term goal setting, which is, we believe, integral to transcending situational disadvantage. And our evaluation focus has been on the participants' experiences of collaborative art making, exhibiting the art, and coming together in these spaces and spaces of safety. And one of the main questions that we've been interested in is, have the participants experienced shifts in their sense of themselves as knowers and learners? And if so, what intended or unintended aspects of the program are generating this impact? And what we find is that, I guess simply, the participants certainly have experienced shifts in their sense of themselves as knowers and learners. But what we found to be interesting is what has allowed this to happen. And for this program, a key aspect has been the creation of a space that has reflection and evaluation embedded in the program design from the beginning. The reflection and the evaluative practices become a means to pursue this goal that we have of social justice. So a few of the evaluation practices that have become significant for this program, I'm going to explore. Decision-making. The decision-making is inclusive of all participants with the intention that it creates a flattened hierarchy. I'll emphasize that this is a space with human service practitioners, their clients, and university staff. And so the potential for knowledge and expertise hierarchies playing out as a dynamic it's a big concern of ours. And so this commitment to inclusive decision-making is practiced in the very kind of simple form of ongoing questions of, what did you think? Did that work well? Should we have done that differently? And in terms of methods, this isn't anything extraordinary. However, if it's practiced in the context of a social justice evaluation methodology, these questions can do many things, some of which are a valuing of all the participants' experience and knowledge, both within the program context, but also beyond the program, which we feel is a very important aspect. The questions, they have the potential to build a confidence in the self and group reflection, and a confidence to share this reflection with the group. This meant that there was a smooth transition from the group participation, from the reflection practices into the more formal evaluation practices. And again, that idea of it being embedded in the program from the beginning. And these questions, although initially modeled by Flick in the facilitation process, they quickly become used by all the participants, and it adds to that sense of a flattened hierarchy and a shared space. Another practice is managing and coordinating the program and evaluation space by all the participants. And this creates a sense of capability, a sense of independence, and also a sense of non-reliance, where those kind of traditional knowledge and expertise hierarchies might play out. This capacity building in both the art skills and the running of the program was a positive learning experience, and it developed a sense of ownership of the program. And we also feel that there's something special going on with the art. The art making itself is certainly important as an evaluation method. The imaginative and the expressive processes become tools of inquiry in themselves for generating a kind of, it generates a kind of iterative practice and a kind of ongoing practice of reflection. And the program, it aims to influence ways of thinking, and ideally we would like to think that it interrupts those narratives of victimhood, which produce deficit constructions of lack of resilience and lack of capability. And so the focus is then on this, this transcendence and building possibilities for the future. Another aspect is an idea we've described as gentle yarning conversations. And they are initiated by Flick, our colleague, and they ebb and flow during the program sessions. The women who share histories of violence, they're supported and encouraged to imagine a hopeful future, which transcends their exposure to traumatic life events. From the outset, the women are regarded as emerging artists with the talent to develop and exhibit quality works. And this new dimension of identity, it can generate a sense of being a learner and a knowledge holder. And it also affords the opportunity for all participants to reflect on the art practices and the art practices. And in turn, this reflection then extends into all aspects of the program and the conversations that take place. So these methods are just one example, just a slice really of how we re-articulate accountability and evaluation. There is a direct accountability in this case to the participants of the program. And there's a sort of a kind of a symbiotic relationship between the methods and the methodology, in that, as I've just said, the methods aren't anything particularly extraordinary in themselves. However, when they are imbued with a social justice methodology, they have the potential to contribute to the pursuit of social justice. And to touch on quickly some of the things that we've seen in the evaluation data itself on these methods. This idea of self-worth, and we see this come up a lot, and there's a shift in the participants' sense of self-worth, something that was identified by the practitioners as being absent in them or of a very low level. Sarah Amsler talks about the undoing of democratic forms of agency and its implications for the type of subject that this creates, and the type of futures that get imagined by those subjects. And so instead, reclaiming my place, we see it as a space that it's reclaimed as a democratic site, and it has this flattened hierarchy where the knowledges and experiences are valued by all those present and involved in, they're all involved in the undertaking of the evaluation. Peer support and vulnerability. A reliance on the practitioners and the facilitator as the experts and the guides, it steadily disappears and has disappeared, with it being replaced by the participants as the supports and the guides to each other. And the vulnerability is experienced by everyone participating, including the practitioners, when they have to wrestle with the art skills, and the program collaboration again is another certainly moment of vulnerability, which again helps to create this kind of flattened hierarchy and a leveling of the space. And again, we see it as this kind of opportunity for a sense of agency or control over your life. Hope, the word hope has been used a lot in the evaluation data. Through the program and the evaluation, the participants get this get a sense of agency. And it's Amsler who actually, she describes this as these practices they create this sense of an anticipatory consciousness. And she uses this kind of language to capture this idea of hope. And it has the potential to shift our perceptions of possible futures. And drawing directly on Amsler, on her own words, evaluation facilitates the invention of new capacities, which enlarge possibilities for yet unimaginable alternative futures to emerge. And so, oddly, I guess you could say, thinking about the past, as in practices of reflection and evaluation, when done in a certain way, can create new futures that previously hadn't been imagined. So just to finish off and to recap our main points, SRHE's evaluation work happens in a broader national and international context of a preferred or hegemonic understanding of evaluation as something that is objective, value-free, independent, that zombie positivism that Matt mentioned before quoting Lafler. And we argue that in this space of equity, widening participation work, where social justice, in our language, but we feel it captures it, the social justice is the goal that guides this work. And such an approach to evaluation is not appropriate. And instead, we need different approaches that have methodologies infused with social justice. And there are many ways that this can be undertaken. And what we've offered here is a few examples where agency and knowledge of participants is prioritized, with an ongoing practice of reflection that allows for new, previously unimagined futures to be considered. Thank you, that's me.
Thanks for that, Raoul and Matt. So I'll just open it up for questions, but Barbara Reid has asked, and thanks, Barbara. In relation to evaluation, it's so difficult when the funders would like evidence that their initiatives have worked. How can we change that discourse?
Raoul, did you want me to?
Yeah, you go for it.
Offer something, and please jump in. It's such an urgent and important question, Barbara. Thank you. It's something we really struggle with, and we're not sure about the answers there. I suppose one a few ways we're trying is acknowledging that what works imperative and actually trying to work through it with subsequent questions such as, and whether it be in the commissioning of evaluation or inside of a process, actually commencing by acknowledging the sort of technologies at play, the conceptual technologies at play, like value and impact, and then asking those next questions like what works for whom, in what context, over what duration, and why. And I'm thinking of a few situations where we've done exactly that with primary school age children, just a couple of hours west of here, and they were, of course, able to lean into that and work with it, and because they're experiencing these forces, and I suppose conceptualizing these spaces as pedagogical and not in a monodirectional kind of manner, but as let's learn across difference. Things are possible. I suppose it's a big sort of monolithic discourse there that you point to, that an edifice to try and tackle, but I suppose that's some of the ways to actually lean into the concepts at play and actually codify them together with participants, and that might be senior leaders, it might be folks in department. Like let's come to terms with these terms. I suppose that's something I would argue for, but
Thank you. Sorry, I'm having problems with my computer at the moment, but I can't get the picture up. But yeah, just to say thank you. It's something that I've come across in sort of doing evaluation work myself, or being asked to, and then finding it so hard to fit into this sort of positivist shell, as it were, and really having a charity, an NGO that was the funder, who was sympathetic, but they were saying, in order for us to get further funding, we need to have, concrete evidence that X, has improved. And it was so hard to navigate that, as you say, that sort of overwhelming monolith. I think you mentioned that, the political construction of hopelessness, and it feels like that way with the sort of challenging these paradigms. Yeah,
Come
thanks.
in. Barbara, yeah, thank you for your comments. And it's, I think we feel a lot of empathy and sympathy with what you're saying. We experience it as well. I don't have much to add to what Matt said, but maybe just something I could flag is something that we've drawn on quite a lot is a paper by an academic called Gert Biesta. And the title of the paper is actually Why What Works Won't Work. And we found it quite an inspirational paper because it really, it's reassuring in the sense of if you begin with that question, there's a problem. And it's the questions that should come before that that need to get asked. So maybe, yeah, that's worth checking out.
And just following up on that, I mean, when you're actually doing, I think that one of the difficulties that I'm in kind of navigating between hegemonic forms of evaluation, how do you, if as you're negotiating that space, how do you actually remain accountable to participants, you know, as you're sort of navigating that kind of counter-hegemonic narrative? When you're taking on the hegemonic, how do you actually kind of engage with participants in the same way?
Yeah. I mean, these are urgent questions, and yeah, I think for me, coming to these questions of evaluation came out of my my PhD, which came out of getting tangled up in the process of Australia following the UK into a lot of funding being injected into higher education to do outreach activity as part of importing the widening participation agenda. And then getting asked to evaluate that work that I was involved in building and not having access to a lot of critical tools at the time, and then slowly gaining access and really starting to see and to worry a lot about how my own sort of white male middle class positionality was deeply implicated in constructing not just the programs, but the evaluative sort of efforts. And I was not in a good position to do that work you're talking about there. And I noticed there's a comment in the chat as well. It's really important. So I suppose it's in SRHE for us, it's about at times trying to drag the focus to these very questions and not seek solutions necessarily, but to try and with as you know, diverse groups and individuals and communities to try and make them the privileged actors in those spaces, sometimes the target of those that gaze, rather than targeted participants in communities who are constructed as vulnerable, disadvantaged, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll stop there because I imagine we're probably running out of time, Matt, but thanks everyone. That's
Yeah, thanks for that, Matt. And if we have time at the end, perhaps we can tackle some of the extra questions that are in the chat. Well, thanks very much. We'll move to our final paper for the symposium. And this is a paper by Professor Penny Jane Burke and Dr. Stephanie Hardacre. And this is called Reimagining Gender Equity Through Exploring the Impact of Gender-Based Violence on University Access and Participation. So thanks, Penny.
Thank you, Matt. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, and everybody can see the PowerPoint. Good, okay, excellent. Well, I just wanted to start off by saying a little bit about the two papers and its connection to this paper, because as you may have gathered in SRHE, we're very interested in the potential by reframing equity work through the lens of social justice praxis and really bringing action and reflection in constant dialogue with each other, but also creating these opening up these new kind of pedagogical timescapes in which we work in participatory ways with the communities that we're engaging with, both outside of the university and inside the university, that we can work towards driving towards, kind of challenging the hegemonic practices and structures of the university, and also to try to bring attention to the university's relationship with broader inequalities, multidimensional and complex inequalities. So rather than only look at, the work of bringing people into the university space, and we have a whole kind of critique of the problems around that, it's really about also trying to understand the historical and ongoing and new forms of inequalities that continue to shape experiences of higher education. So in our paper, we're trying to broaden out some of the questions around understanding the relationship of higher education to the staggering social problem phenomenon of gender-based violence, and how that impacts on experiences of university access and participation, but also in trying to understand that the relationship the relationship of the university, I suppose, to thinking about its role and responsibility to questions around gender-based violence in relationship to claims to be committed to gender equity and so on. So I'm talking on behalf of a wonderful project team. So Julia Kofi unfortunately can't be with us this evening, but we're presenting together this morning, actually in English time. We're presenting together tomorrow, and Stephanie is going to be co-presenting with me tonight. But also just building on what Ryle was just talking about with the example of reclaiming my place. We've drawn on reclaiming my place in this project. We're not going to talk about that today, but Felicity and Julia Shaw have also brought a program into the university for our student participants to engage in arts-based workshops, which has also been evaluated and will be part of a report that we'll be publishing shortly. So we're very excited about that dimension of the project as well. So just to give some context, gendered violence has been identified as a global pandemic with significant implications for educational access and participation internationally. And renewed efforts have been put into place to address what UN Women have called the shadow pandemic, in light of data that has revealed that gendered violence, and particularly domestic violence, has intensified since the onslaught of COVID-19. And so in relation to such concerns, universities are challenged, as I said, to understand and respond to gendered violence is what we're arguing. However, there's been little attention to this in higher education research and in policy terms, aside from more explicit attention that's been given more recently to sexual violence on campus. So we argue that as part of a broader commitment to gender equity, universities have a responsibility to consider their role and relationship to this shadow pandemic. So our research questions are around trying to understand the patterns and forms of gendered violence that students have experienced over their lifetime, and how this might impact on their journeys to and experiences in higher education. So we attend to the following research questions. What are students' lived experiences of higher education in the context of prior, present, and or ongoing experiences of gendered violence? So we really want to understand that temporality in relationship to university participation. What forms of gendered violence have university students experienced over their lifetimes, and how do universities understand and or respond to gendered violence in the context of broader commitments to gender equity, if at all? So just to give a little bit more context, there's a very small body of literature in existence so far that documents the impact of gendered violence on access to and participation in higher education. And this shows that student survivors struggle to negotiate the demands of academic coursework whilst coping with memories of past abuse, that gendered violence is a significant disruptor to higher education participation, including experiences of isolation and impact on academic achievement. And a small body of literature explores the role that higher education can play in alleviating some of the impacts of gender-based violence. This includes raised self-esteem, a sense of well-being and empowerment, a developed sense of independence, self-sufficiency, and safety, and an important way to overcome economic disadvantages that are related to gender-based violence. So in terms of our methodological framework, we're situating this in relationship to some of the critiques of equity and widening participation around the hegemonic deficit discourses that operate to pathologize underrepresented groups and also to conceal the multidimensional and intersecting inequalities that students must navigate in order to access and participate in higher education. So we're really trying to contest some of those neoliberalized, individualistic discourses that place the responsibility for individual transformation on the student who is constructed through the lens of disadvantage, rather than on understanding the kind of complex relationship between micro-level experiences of inequalities in institutions like higher education and macro-level structures and discourses that play out to exacerbate those inequalities. Our research attends to the under-researched dimension of gender-based violence to consider how such hegemonic deficit discourses might engage with problematic notions of victimhood in ways that reproduce individualized and monodimensional explanations of equity in higher education. We interrogate assumptions that access to higher education is predominantly a neoliberal project of improving the individual self outside of power relations and complex gendered inequalities that of course are related to multidimensional other inequalities and differences that colleagues have talked about this evening, or this morning, I should say. We place higher education as a key site of analysis then to consider its role in grappling with the deeply entrenched and multi-layered personal and social histories of gender-based violence. And the project situates higher education as a space of possibility for both the social reproduction and the social transformation of complex inequalities. So, we're not saying that one is not happening. I think that these things are happening simultaneously, but we do have a kind of position of hopefulness that there is the capacity to build methodologies towards social transformation. Framed by feminist theories, we analyze student survivors' lived and embodied experiences of gendered inequalities, not in terms then of individual overcoming, but of residual, personal, collective, and ongoing dimensions of struggle. We understand experiences of gendered violence as deeply relational and connected to complex power relations, continuously resituated within interconnected institutional timescapes, drawing on Barbara Adams' 1998 concept of timescapes, which has captured our imagination. So in terms of what we actually did, this is a pilot study, and we are planning to extend and build on this over 2022. So we sent out an invitation to all students in one single college at the University of Newcastle to participate, and students who identified as having experienced gender-based violence were eligible to participate. And 24 students completed a questionnaire and took part in an in-depth interview. So we were really interested in the questionnaire to understand the temporalities around experiences of gender-based violence, the different forms of violence that students may have experienced or continue to experience, and the different spatialities around their experiences. And then in the interviews, we were able to follow up and build on that knowledge collected through the questionnaires by exploring their experiences of higher education specifically. So we didn't go into any detail about any traumatic experiences, but rather we're trying to understand the relationship between those experiences and their constructions and understanding of the significance of higher education for their lives and for their futures. And as I said, they were also invited to take part in feminist arts-based workshops that were designed to open up a space of connection with a focus on claiming their space. We will touch on, we weren't able to touch on this for the symposium, but if you are interested, we are publishing the report hopefully next month, and that will be covered in our report. So I'll now hand over to Steph.
Thank you, Penny, and hello, everyone. So I'll be briefly discussing the quantitative and qualitative results arising from our analysis. So I will just note again that this is based on 24 students. So through our questionnaire, we were able to identify a key pattern in terms of the temporalities of gender-based violence experienced by the student survivors. So firstly, the age at which students experienced their first incident of gendered violence ranged from just 5 years of age through to 28 years, with an average age of 14. Students' most recent experiences of gender-based violence, ranged from occurring in the past week to more than 11 years ago. However, the most common time frame for recent experiences was within the past 2 to 4 years. 5 of the students that we interviewed indicated that they were currently experiencing gendered violence at the time of taking the survey, while all 24 of the students acknowledged that they personally knew of someone other than themselves who had also experienced a form of gendered violence at some time throughout their life. We were able to also examine the forms of gender-based violence that students had experienced. So the most common form of violence was psychological and emotional violence. So this includes acts like gaslighting or isolation from friends and family, among other forms of abuse. So all 24 students had experienced psychological and emotional violence at some stage. This was very closely followed by verbal violence. So for example, insults or threats, and both verbal and non-verbal sexual harassment, including acts like catcalling and sexual gestures. So concerningly, 87.5% of the students had experienced at least one form of gendered violence while they were in an intimate relationship. We also identified the various contexts and settings in which students had experienced any form of violence, and almost all of the students had experienced at least one form at home. In line with previous research, the most common setting in which students had experienced any of the forms of violence that we asked about was actually at home, either theirs or someone else's private residence. So this was with the exception of verbal and non-verbal sexual harassment, and these were most commonly experienced either on the street or at an entertainment venue such as a bar, a nightclub, or a sports stadium. Thank you, Penny. So our analysis shows that the impact of gendered violence on university study is complex and wide-ranging. So as Penny mentioned, due to time constraints, we're only able to give you a small snapshot of this tonight or this morning, but there will be a detailed report coming out in January, hopefully. So experiences of gendered violence often led to feelings of isolation, including low self-esteem, disconnection, and a lack of belonging. So a sense of not belonging or feeling different to their fellow students. So as one student, Rochelle, put it, I think certainly gendered violence can reduce your confidence. It makes you feel small and stupid, and maybe that you don't want to finish the degree because what good would you be? You know, if you're so dumb, how can you help people? So feelings of anxiety related to gendered violence were identified as challenging engagement with higher education. So another student, Vera, explained, am I just going to, you know, work out that I am quite stupid, or, you know, so there's that whole, I guess, anxiety around failing. Thank you, Penny. So the theme of shame was also quite salient across the students' accounts. So shame is felt in the body as a lack of self-worth and disconnection. Personal sensibilities of shame are concealed, are typically generated through wider gendered inequalities, but they're concealed through the deficit discourses that place the weight of responsibility for overcoming social disadvantage on individuals to conform to institutionalized expectations. So one student, Ellie, described the individualizing and shaming process of escaping an abusive relationship while at the same time being enrolled as a university student. So Ellie said, it just brings a lot of shame and guilt on victims because that idea of society, it's victim blaming, it's their fault. So overall, you just don't want to speak up about it. University was also described as the centerpiece in beginning a new life. So as a kind of escape from gendered violence. Escaping from abusive intimate partner relationships often signaled a new phase or opportunity for new beginnings, and to take previously unthought of or even unavailable paths, such as the path to tertiary education. So a lot of the students suggested that university study was a significant source of personal development for them. It kind of challenged abusive narratives in order to build this strong sense of capability and confidence. So SRHE, one of our students, described gaining confidence over time throughout her studies and becoming emboldened by the process as she completed Open Foundation to move into further study. For some students, higher education can provide a valuable form of awareness raising and even the capacity to articulate concerns about the social nature of gendered violence, about institutionalized misogyny, and then through those means and that knowledge, they can then go on to support others as well. Experiences of surviving gendered violence can also provide a kind of incentive to explore and develop personal sensibilities of potential after the damaging and abusive deficit discourses or of lack of capability. So as Zara's words illuminate, I have no problem talking about my experiences with violence in the past because I'm very much of the belief that they made me who I am. It made me want to be better after being told, you can't do this, you can't do that for so long. After getting out of that relationship, I was like, yes, I can. And since then, every time I see an opportunity come up and I'm like, you might not be good enough, it kind of makes me think, no, you are, just do it. So yeah, it's definitely pushed me to push myself, I guess. Thanks, Penny. So gendered violence experiences reverberate as students navigate higher education, and it often has significant effects on their sense of self, their sense of safety, and their capability. So one of our students, Ellie, talks about this as kind of living in a different world almost, and the disorienting temporal spatialities that students negotiate in higher education can have a major impact on their studies. So Ellie explained, you can't complete the normal demands of what a student could in a healthy environment because you're living in a different world, really. So you're trying to work out how to exit the situation, but at the same time, you're at breaking point. So mentally, you're just really broken. Another student, Sally, explained that there's different cultural environments that she experiences across her joint degree, depending on what faculty she's in. So with some offering good support, contrasted by an almost complete lack of willingness to help her navigate the crisis situation she was experiencing. Another student, Tara, echoes this in her account as well. So both Sully and Tara signal this kind of breaking point that Ellie discussed previously. So Sully explains, I think when a course coordinator or your teacher gets told that you've been through 2 sexual assaults and that you're escaping a DV relationship, I think they should feel like they need to do something. Tara said, I just felt like I couldn't bring it up as another reason because they'd be like, oh, well, you said that before. I'll now pass it back to Penny to discuss the recommendations that arose from the students' accounts.
Thanks, Steph. So the students had a wide and insightful set of recommendations for the university to better address gendered violence specifically and its relation to the challenges of building gender equity more broadly. They recommended greater expertise, for example, on the on-campus support provided. So Sully says it would be really good if they had 1 or 2 counselors that were specifically trained and able to counsel people that are going through sexual assault or domestic violence or any sort of thing like that. Student survivors believe universities should foster greater advocacy and awareness to challenge gender-based violence. Zara suggested that there could be open conversations to recognize key issues and, in her words, to call it out. Tara supported these suggestions, pointing to the need for greater knowledge about gender-based violence. Both Ellie and Tara point to the value of developing modules or courses to build advocacy and awareness. So Zara suggests the more that there's open conversations and advocacy and awareness, the more that we can kind of tackle the issue. And it makes you feel like it's not normal because it shouldn't be. And Tara says there should be kind of more knowledge about it, especially emotional and verbal and psychological kind of abusive stuff. The students also suggest that universities could facilitate spaces of support and connection for survivors. This would include structures and programs that enable students' navigation of complex and often inequitable university systems. Rochelle suggests that opening up spaces to bring survivors together would help build new understanding and raise awareness. Ellie recommends support groups, maybe for people who are survivors. They could come together, discuss their experiences and how they are moving forward. So just to wrap up, and I can see that we're already out of time, gender-based violence is a huge issue for Australian society and also British society and other national contexts, but it's largely invisible at the moment in higher education as a very much under-researched area. Gender-based violence has significant impact on higher education access and participation, it seems, from our pilot study. And this includes self-determination, tenacity, but also shame, silencing, isolation, lack of the important resources that are required, and support and safe housing as well, which we didn't have time to touch on, but emerged from our project. The temporalities of gender-based violence trauma do not fit into the current support mechanisms of higher education. So there seems to be kind of a misalignment there. We need deeper understanding then of the ongoing effects, challenges, and concerns at many different levels, including cultural, pedagogical, and practical levels. So, you know, discourses such as overcoming or even identifying barriers are not, they're not appropriate to be able to address these ongoing sets of dynamics and power relations that the student survivors are navigating. Gender-based violence expertise around counseling is really needed. The student survivors talked a lot about being sent away because the expertise wasn't available. And really high level, high quality navigational support is required to help both students and staff around these issues. Broader forms of awareness raising around gender-based violence was seen by the students as a key way that universities could better respond to the challenges it raises. And as I said, we're currently building on this pilot to extend the research and develop a more detailed picture of the significance of higher education for survivors of gender-based violence. But in the meantime, we will be publishing our report, and we're really excited because the student survivors who participated in the arts-based workshops will be illustrating the report. So it's going to be a beautiful weaving together of their voices, of their artwork, and also of our analysis. Thank you very much.